I pulled into the Mammoth Hot Springs Ranger Station parking lot with my windows down, letting the cool mountain air fill the cab of my truck. The drive from Minneapolis had taken 2 days, and every mile west had felt like putting more distance between me and the mess I'd left behind. The Yellowstone job posting had seemed like exactly what I needed: isolated, purposeful, a chance to help people while staying away from crowds and complications. The parking lot was mostly empty at 7 in the morning, just a few government vehicles with Park Service logos. I grabbed my paperwork from the passenger seat and checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. Clean shave, short hair, the kind of presentation that said I could follow orders and wouldn't cause problems. That was the goal anyway. The ranger station was a low stone building that looked like it had been here since the park's founding. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed over a reception area with wooden benches and wildlife posters covering the walls. A woman in her mid-40s stood behind the counter, auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her Park Service uniform was pressed and professional, but she had the kind of weathered hands that said she'd spent real time outdoors. "Bruce Rue?" She looked up from a stack of paperwork as I approached. "Yes, ma'am, reporting for orientation." "Summer Bailey, park supervisor." Her handshake was firm, businesslike. "Welcome to Yellowstone. How was the drive?" "Long but good. Beautiful country out here." "It is that." She pulled a manila folder from beneath the counter. "We'll get you processed and out on patrol. Coffee?" "I'm fine, thank you." Summer opened the folder and spread several documents across the counter. Standard employment forms, emergency contact information, radio protocols. Nothing unexpected until she pulled out a single sheet of white paper with 6 numbered items typed in courier font. "These are our local protocols," she said, sliding the paper toward me. "Every ranger working this section needs to follow them exactly." I picked up the sheet and read the first rule. If you encounter a bear walking backward, do not make eye contact. Continue your patrol route without stopping or alerting dispatch. The words didn't make sense together. I read it again, then looked up at Summer. Walking backward? That's correct. I scanned the rest of the list. Rule 2 involved offering water to after-hours visitors but not answering their questions. Rule 3 required specific patrol timing after sunset. Rule 4 stated that if I heard a child crying in the wilderness, I should not investigate under any circumstances. Rule 5 involved barricading myself inside the nearest station if I heard 3 wolf howls in sequence. Rule 6 instructed me to drive away immediately if I encountered 3 or more people sitting together outdoors. "Ma'am, I have to ask, is this some kind of new employee hazing?" Summer's expression didn't change. No smile, no acknowledgement that the rules were unusual. "These protocols have been developed over years of experience in this area. They're not negotiable." But a bear walking backward? Wildlife behavior can be unpredictable, especially in thermal areas where the ground affects their movement patterns. Her tone stayed level, professional. The important thing is following the protocols exactly as written. I looked at the paper again. The rules read like something from a horror movie, not a federal employment manual. But Summer's demeanor suggested she was completely serious, and I needed this job. After everything that had happened overseas, after months of therapy and applications and rejections, Yellowstone represented a fresh start. I wasn't about to blow it by questioning my supervisor on day 1. "Understood. Follow the protocols." "Exactly." Summer pulled a radio from a charging station and handed it to me. Channel 7 for routine communication, Channel 3 for emergencies. Your patrol vehicle is the white Ford Explorer with unit number 12. She slid a set of keys across the counter. "Today, you'll be covering the Lamar Valley route. Familiarize yourself with the roads and visibility points." I clipped the radio to my belt and pocketed the keys. The weight of them felt good, official. "What about backup? Other rangers in the area?" "Your solo patrol for now. Radio check every 2 hours." Summer gathered the employment paperwork. "Any other questions?" Several dozen, actually, but I could hear the finality in her voice. "No, ma'am. I'll get started." Bruce? She looked at me directly for the first time since I'd arrived. The protocols exist for good reasons. Follow them exactly. The parking lot was brighter when I stepped outside, though that might have been relief at escaping the fluorescent lights. Unit 12 was easy to spot, a white Explorer with government plates and a light bar on the roof. The interior smelled like coffee and stale air freshener, with a laptop mounted between the seats and a clipboard of forms secured to the dashboard. I adjusted the seat and mirrors, then spread a park map across the steering wheel. The Lamar Valley route covered the northeast section, a loop that would take me through some of the most remote parts of the park. Perfect for getting my bearings without dealing with tourist crowds. The radio crackled as I started the engine. Unit 12, radio check. I picked up the handset. Unit 12 operational. Copy. Have a good patrol. The drive out of Mammoth Hot Springs took me through terrain that shifted from high desert to mountain forest. Traffic was light. A few early morning photographers heading toward wildlife viewing areas. I passed several other Park Service vehicles, the drivers raising their hands in acknowledgement. Normal, professional interactions that helped settle the unease from summer's briefing. The Lamar Valley opened up ahead of me like something from a nature documentary. Rolling grassland stretched between forested ridges, with the Lamar River winding through the middle distance. Bison grazed in scattered groups, and I spotted what might have been elk near a distant tree line. This was why I'd wanted the job. Space, wildlife, the kind of natural beauty that made human problems seem manageable. I drove slowly, checking turnouts and trail access points. The radio stayed quiet except for occasional chatter from other units. Around 10 o'clock, I pulled over at a scenic overlook to update my patrol log. The valley spread out below me, peaceful and vast. Maybe the weird rules were just summer's way of testing how well I'd follow orders. Military experience had taught me that every organization had its quirks and unofficial procedures. 3 hours into patrol, I was driving a winding section of road that followed the valley's northern edge. Dense forest pressed close to the asphalt, with occasional glimpses of meadows between the trees. I'd settled into the rhythm of the route, enjoying the solitude and the steady background chatter on the radio. That's when I saw the bear. It was moving down a steep hillside about 50 yards from the road, a massive grizzly with dark brown fur. But something was wrong with its movement. Instead of walking normally down the slope, it was backing down, rear legs first, front paws feeling for purchase behind it. The motion looked deliberate, controlled, like it was performing some kind of elaborate dance. I slowed the vehicle, trying to process what I was seeing. Bears could walk backward. I'd seen it in zoos when they were playing or avoiding something, but this looked different, purposeful. The grizzly moved with careful precision, never looking where it was going, as if the backward motion was completely natural. The first rule flashed through my memory. If you encounter a bear walking backward, do not make eye contact. I forced myself to look away from the bear and focus on the road ahead, but my peripheral vision caught its movement, and something about the animal's posture made my skin crawl. It wasn't just walking backward, it was watching the road, watching me. I pressed the accelerator, increasing speed without being obvious about it. The bear continued its strange descent, and I caught a glimpse of its head turning to track my vehicle. Its eyes seemed too focused, too aware. Most wild animals would have fled at the sound of the engine, but this one kept moving backward down the slope, like my presence was exactly what it expected. The road curved away from the hillside, blocking my view of the bear. I checked the rearview mirror but couldn't see anything through the trees. My hands had tightened on the steering wheel without me realizing it, and I made a conscious effort to relax my grip. Just a bear with odd behavior. Maybe it had been injured and couldn't turn around normally. Maybe the thermal activity in the ground was affecting its movement. There had to be a logical explanation, even if Summer's rule had made the encounter feel significant. I continued the patrol route, but the image of the backward walking grizzly stayed with me. The way it had watched my vehicle, the deliberate nature of its movement, the coincidence of encountering exactly the scenario described in Rule 1 on my first day. Nothing about it felt random. The radio stayed quiet for the rest of my shift. I completed the loop through Lamar Valley, checked in with dispatch at the required intervals, and filed a routine patrol report that made no mention of unusual wildlife behavior. By the time I returned Unit 12 to the motor pool, the sun was setting behind the mountains. Employee housing was a cluster of small cabins about a mile from the main administrative area. My assigned quarters turned out to be a studio apartment with basic furnishings and a kitchenette, standard government housing, functional but depressing. I'd lived in worse places overseas. I heated a can of soup and sat at the small table with Summer's list of protocols. Reading them again didn't make them any less strange. Rule 4 bothered me the most. Not investigating a crying child went against every instinct I had. Military training had drilled into me the importance of protecting civilians, especially kids. But the rule was explicit. Do not investigate under any circumstances. What kind of place was this where helping a lost child was prohibited? What had happened here to make such rules necessary? I folded the paper and slipped it into my wallet next to my military ID. Tomorrow would bring more patrol shifts, more opportunities to figure out what I'd gotten myself into. Maybe I'd encounter other rangers who could explain the unofficial culture. Maybe Summer would be more forthcoming once I'd proven myself reliable. Outside my window, the mountains were black silhouettes against a star-filled sky. Yellowstone was beautiful, peaceful, exactly what I'd hoped for when I'd applied for the position. But the backward walking bear had left me with questions that wouldn't go away. And Summer's serious demeanor when discussing the protocols suggested they weren't jokes or hazing rituals. I set my alarm for 6:30 and turned off the lights. Whatever was going on here, I'd figure it out eventually. I just had to follow the rules, do my job, and give it time. How complicated could it be? I pulled out of the Towerfall Ranger Station parking lot with my headlights cutting through the mountain darkness, the radio silence more noticeable now that normal park operations had ended for the day. Rule 3 had been specific about after-hours patrol timing. Begin exactly 2 hours after sunset, maintain standard route coverage, report any anomalies immediately. The dashboard clock read 9:17 p.m., putting me right on schedule. The Grand Loop Road stretched ahead in the cone of my headlights, asphalt disappearing into blackness between walls of lodgepole pine. During the day, this section offered scenic overlooks and wildlife viewing opportunities. At night, it felt like driving through a tunnel with no end. I kept my speed steady, checking mile markers against the patrol checklist Summer had provided. 23 miles of road to cover with scheduled stops at 4 designated points. My radio crackled with static, then cleared. No other units were operating in this sector after dark. Standard procedure for remote areas where backup wasn't readily available. The isolation should have been peaceful, but something about the complete silence made me hyper-aware of every shadow that moved beyond my headlights. 20 minutes into the drive, I heard it. Crying. Faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere in the tree line to my right. A child's voice, high and desperate, calling for help. The sound carried clearly through my open window, rising and falling with genuine panic. I slowed the vehicle, then stopped completely, engine idling while I strained to listen. The crying continued, definitely a young voice, maybe a girl. Lost hikers weren't uncommon in Yellowstone, and families sometimes underestimated how quickly darkness could disorient even experienced outdoors people. Every instinct I had screamed that someone needed help. But Rule 4 was burned into my memory. If you hear a child crying in the wilderness, do not investigate under any circumstances. The crying grew closer, moving through the trees toward the road. I could make out words now. Help me, and I can't find them. Repeated over and over with increasing desperation. My hand moved toward the radio to call for backup, then stopped. The rule hadn't mentioned calling for help, only not investigating personally. A small figure emerged from the tree line about 30 yards ahead of my vehicle. A girl, maybe 8 years old, wearing a light blue jacket and jeans. She ran toward my truck with her arms outstretched, tears reflecting in my headlights. Everything about her posture and movement screamed genuine terror. "Please help me," she called out as she approached the driver's side. "I can't find my parents. They were camping and I got lost." I rolled up my window, leaving only a small gap. The girl pressed her face close to the glass, and I could see she'd been crying for a while. Red eyes, streaked cheeks, the kind of exhaustion that comes from hours of fear. She looked exactly like every missing child case I'd seen during my military service, exactly like the kind of situation where hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. "Please," she whispered through the gap. "I've been walking for hours. I'm so scared." My throat felt tight. Everything in my training said to protect civilians, especially children. Everything in my gut said this girl needed immediate help, but Summer's voice echoed in my memory. "Follow the protocols." Exactly. "I can't help you," I said through the window. The words came out harsher than I'd intended. "I'm sorry." The girl's expression shifted from hope to confusion to something that might have been disappointment. "But I'm lost. I need help finding my parents." "I can't help you," I repeated, then put the vehicle in drive. As I pulled away, I watched the girl in my rearview mirror. She stood in the road for a moment, then began running after my vehicle. At first, her pace seemed normal for a frightened child trying to catch up, but as I increased speed, she kept pace. 20 miles per hour, then 30, then 40. The girl was running behind my truck at 40 miles per hour without any sign of effort or strain. I pressed the accelerator harder, watching the speedometer climb. The girl maintained her distance, arms pumping, legs moving in perfect rhythm. Her face showed no exhaustion, no breathlessness. She ran like an Olympic sprinter, but with the casual ease of someone taking a morning jog. For nearly a mile, she kept pace with my vehicle. Then, as abruptly as she'd started running, she simply wasn't there anymore. My rearview mirror showed empty road illuminated by my taillights. I drove the remaining patrol route on autopilot, checking required stops without really seeing them. The image of the running girl played on repeat in my mind. The impossible speed, the effortless stride, the way she'd simply vanished. Either I'd hallucinated the entire encounter, or something was very wrong with what I'd just witnessed. By the time I returned to Tower Fall Station, my hands had stopped shaking enough to complete the required paperwork. I parked Unit 12 in its designated spot and approached the building, keys ready to unlock the entrance. The door was already open. I stood on the threshold, running through my departure routine from earlier. I'd secured the building, checked all entry points, set the radio to monitor mode. The door had definitely been locked, but now it hung slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond. I pushed it open slowly, hand instinctively moving toward my radio. The main office was dimly lit by emergency lighting, casting long shadows across desks and filing cabinets. Someone was sitting at my workstation, a woman in hiking clothes, practical jacket, cargo pants, boots suitable for rough terrain. She looked up as I entered, offering a friendly smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Evening," she said casually, as if sitting in a government building after hours was perfectly normal. "Hope you don't mind me waiting inside. Gets cold out there after dark." Rule 2 surfaced immediately. Offer water to after-hours visitors, but do not answer their questions. I moved to the small kitchenette area and filled a paper cup from the water cooler. "Water?" I held out the cup. "Thank you." She accepted it but didn't drink, just held it between her hands. "I was hoping you could help me with some information about park procedures." I remained silent, standing near the entrance with my keys still in my hand. The woman's presence felt wrong, not just the breaking and entering, but something about her demeanor. Too calm, too prepared, like she'd been expecting me. "I'm curious about Ranger protocols," she continued, studying my face carefully. "Particularly how new employees are trained to handle unusual situations." The question hit too close to the strange rules I'd been given. I kept my expression neutral, following Rule 2 by offering no response. "You seem like someone with military experience," she pressed. "The way you carry yourself, how you scan rooms when you enter. What branch did you serve in?" Still no response from me. She tilted her head, watching my reactions like a scientist observing a lab specimen. "It's an interesting career change," she said. "From combat zones to national parks. What made you choose this particular job? This particular location?" The questions felt invasive, too personal for a random visitor. Normal tourists asked about trail conditions or wildlife viewing. They didn't probe into rangers' military backgrounds or career motivations. But Rule 2 was clear. No answers to questions. The woman waited for nearly a minute, then laughed. The sound made my skin crawl, not because it was loud or harsh, but because it carried no genuine humor. It was the kind of laugh someone might practice in front of a mirror, technically correct, but missing something essentially human. "Well," she said, standing up from my desk, "thanks for the water." She walked toward the door, passing close enough that I caught her scent, not perfume or soap, but something clinical like antiseptic. At the threshold, she turned back. "Have a good rest of your shift," she said, then stepped into the darkness and disappeared. I locked the door behind her, checking the deadbolt twice before moving to the window. The parking lot was empty except for my patrol vehicle. No car, no bicycle, no sign of how she'd arrived or how she planned to leave. The nearest road was 3 miles away, and the terrain between here and there was rough hiking at best. I settled at my desk to complete the patrol report, trying to focus on routine paperwork instead of the evening's encounters. The forms required documentation of mileage, fuel consumption, notable wildlife observations, and interactions with park visitors. I filled in the basics without mentioning running children or uninvited guests, following what seemed to be an unspoken protocol about keeping reports mundane. 30 minutes later, 3 distinct wolf howls echoed across the valley. The sound was unmistakable. Deep, resonant calls that carried for miles in the mountain air. But these weren't the usual pack communications I'd heard during training videos. Each howl came from a different direction, perfectly spaced, almost like signals being passed between positions. Rule 5 flashed through my memory. If you hear 3 wolf howls in sequence, barricade yourself inside the nearest station until dawn. I moved quickly, checking every window latch and door lock. The station had been built for security with heavy frames and reinforced entry points. I wedged chairs under door handles and pulled filing cabinets in front of the main windows. Within 10 minutes, the building was as secure as I could make it. Then I settled in to wait. Strange sounds began almost immediately. Footsteps circling the building. Not the random pattern of wildlife, but deliberate pacing like someone conducting surveillance. Scratching at windows, testing the latches I'd just secured. At one point, something heavy scraped across the roof, moving from one end to the other with mechanical precision. The sounds continued for hours, sometimes fading to nothing before resuming with renewed intensity. I sat at my desk with the radio in my hand, following Rule 5 exactly, waiting for dawn to release me from whatever was prowling outside. I drove back to Mammoth Hot Springs as the first hints of sunrise crept over the mountains, my shift radio crackling with routine morning traffic. The night at Tower Fall Station felt like something from a fever dream. Wolf howls, prowling sounds, hours of waiting behind barricaded doors. But here I was, heading to the Fishing Bridge Visitor Center for a scheduled meeting with Stephen Norwood, Senior Ranger, as if nothing unusual had happened. The employee schedule board in the main office had listed our 9 a.m. appointment without explanation. Summer had mentioned Stephen during my orientation, describing him as someone with 30-plus years of park experience who could help me understand local procedures. After 2 days of following bizarre rules and encountering things that didn't make sense, I welcomed the chance to talk with a veteran ranger who might provide some context. Fishing Bridge sat along the northern shore of Yellowstone Lake, a collection of buildings that served as both visitor services and administrative hub for the Lake District. I found Stephen's patrol vehicle in the parking lot, an older Ford Explorer with faded paint and equipment racks that suggested serious field use. Through the visitor center windows, I spotted a tall man in ranger uniform examining wall displays with the unhurried attention of someone killing time. Stephen Norwood looked exactly like central casting would order for experienced park ranger. Graying blonde hair, weathered face, the kind of relaxed posture that came from decades of outdoor work. He turned as I entered, offering a firm handshake and the sort of genuine smile that immediately put people at ease. "Bruce, right? Heard we got a new guy. Steve Norwood." His voice carried a slight Montana drawl. "How you settling in?" "Still learning the ropes, but getting there. Always takes time. Different animal than most federal jobs." He gestured toward the lake beyond the windows. "Coffee? Got a fresh pot in the back office." We settled at a small table overlooking the water, steaming cups between us. Stephen had the manner of someone completely comfortable in his environment, the kind of ranger who tourists trusted instinctively and who could navigate bureaucracy as easily as wilderness trails. "Summer mentioned your military," he said, stirring his coffee. "Afghanistan?" "2 tours, combat medic." "Good background for this work. Helps with the observation skills, staying calm under pressure." Stephen leaned back in his chair. "Bet you've seen some interesting wildlife already. Bears, maybe?" The question felt casual enough, but something in his tone made me wonder if he knew about my encounter with the backward-walking grizzly. "Some. Still learning the behavior patterns. They're fascinating animals, smarter than people give them credit for." Stephen sipped his coffee, watching my face. Funny thing happened yesterday. Got a report about a missing kid from one of the camping areas. Little girl, maybe 8 years old, light blue jacket, jeans. Family said she wandered off from their campsite 3 nights ago. My throat tightened. The description matched the crying child exactly. The girl who'd run after my vehicle at impossible speed before vanishing into darkness. But Stephen delivered the information with the same casual tone he'd used to discuss coffee, as if missing children were routine administrative matters. 3 nights ago? I kept my voice neutral. Yeah, Park Service has search and rescue protocols, of course. Coordinate with local law enforcement, helicopter sweeps if weather permits. Stephen shrugged. These things usually work themselves out. Kids wander back to camp, turn up at visitor centers. Amazing how far they can walk when they get turned around. He drained his coffee cup and stood up, the conversation apparently finished. No mention of search teams, no urgency about a child missing for multiple days, no request for patrol units to maintain heightened awareness. The casual dismissal felt deeply wrong, but I couldn't articulate why without revealing my own encounter with the girl. "Anyway," Stephen continued, "main reason I wanted to meet was to go over some local patrol specifics. Summer mentioned you're handling solo routes? Lamar Valley yesterday, Tower Fall last night. Good sectors for getting your feet wet. Today you'll want to cover the Lake District, Fishing Bridge to Bridge Bay, then south toward West Thumb. Scenic route, decent traffic volume, good place to practice visitor interactions." Stephen handed me a route map with checkpoints marked in red ink. The patrol pattern looked straightforward, covering tourist areas and main road access points around Yellowstone Lake's northern shore. Normal ranger duties that had nothing to do with bizarre rules or impossible wildlife behavior. Radio check every 2 hours, standard reports. Questions about anything, just call. Stephen headed toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Bruce, those protocols Summer gave you, they might seem unusual, but they're based on real experience, worth following exactly." He left me alone in the visitor center, staring at the lake through windows that reflected my own uncertain expression. Stephen's casual attitude toward the missing child bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Military training had drilled into me the importance of urgency when civilians were in danger, especially kids. But Stephen had discussed the situation like a routine paperwork issue, something that would work itself out without intervention. I spent the morning completing the assigned patrol route, checking campground access points and stopping to assist tourists with directions and park information. Normal ranger work that felt almost therapeutic after the strangeness of my first 2 days. Families asked about fishing regulations. Photographers wanted advice about wildlife viewing locations. Hikers requested trail condition updates. Routine interactions that reminded me why I'd wanted this job. But the image of the missing child kept surfacing. A little girl in a light blue jacket, exactly matching the figure I'd encountered on the dark road near Tower Fall. The coincidence felt too significant to ignore, yet Rule 4 had been explicit about not investigating crying children under any circumstances. Either the rule was designed to prevent rangers from helping legitimate missing persons, or something else was happening that I didn't understand. Around 2 in the afternoon, I was driving the southern section of my patrol route when I spotted them. 3 people sat on a bench overlooking Yellowstone Lake, positioned about 50 yards from the road. 2 adults and what appeared to be a teenager, all facing the water with perfect stillness. Even from a distance, their posture seemed wrong, too rigid, too precisely arranged. They weren't talking, weren't moving, weren't engaging in any of the normal behaviors you'd expect from people enjoying a scenic view. As I approached in my patrol vehicle, the teenagers slowly turned to look directly at me. The movement was mechanical, deliberate, like a security camera tracking a target. The teenager's face broke into a wide smile that didn't match their eyes, an expression that looked practiced rather than spontaneous. They maintained eye contact as I drove past, head turning to follow my vehicle's progress. Rule 6 surfaced immediately. If you encounter 3 or more people sitting together outdoors, drive away immediately. I pressed the accelerator, increasing speed without being obvious about it. In my rearview mirror, I watched all 3 figures turn in unison to watch my departure. They moved with synchronized precision, like dancers following choreography, maintaining their fixed positions on the bench while tracking my vehicle until the road curved out of sight. The encounter left me shaken in ways I couldn't explain. Normal tourists didn't sit in perfect stillness for extended periods. Normal people didn't smile at passing rangers with that kind of unsettling intensity. And normal families certainly didn't move with mechanical coordination, as if they were performing rather than simply existing. I completed the remainder of my patrol on autopilot, checking required stops while my mind replayed the scene at the lake. The 3 figures had felt staged, arranged for my benefit like actors hitting their marks, but that interpretation led to questions I wasn't ready to confront, questions about who might be staging such encounters and why. Evening brought relief in the form of routine. I returned my patrol vehicle to the motor pool, filed the required paperwork, and headed to the employee cafeteria at Mammoth Hot Springs for dinner. The dining area was basic but functional, with a handful of tables and a serving line that offered simple meals for park staff. After 2 days of eating alone in my quarters, the prospect of company appealed to me. Johnny Scott was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, picking at a plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. I'd met him briefly during orientation, another new ranger, maybe mid-20s, with the nervous energy of someone still adjusting to the job. He looked up as I approached with my tray, offering a tentative smile. "Mind if I sit?" "Please." Johnny gestured to the empty chair across from him. "How's the patrol work treating you?" I settled in with my dinner, grateful for normal conversation. "Learning curve, but getting the hang of it." "You?" "Been here 8 months now." Johnny's hands trembled slightly as he cut his meatloaf, still figuring things out. 8 months. That was longer than I'd expected for someone who still seemed so uncertain. Most jobs had learning periods measured in weeks, not the better part of a year. I studied Johnny's face more carefully, noticing the dark circles under his eyes and the way he kept glancing around the dining area as if checking for surveillance. "Same patrol routes?" I asked. "Similar, they rotate us through different sectors." Johnny lowered his voice, leaning closer across the table. "You been following the rules Summer gave you?" The question hit like cold water. Johnny's tone suggested he knew exactly what rules I'd received, which meant the protocols weren't unique to my assignment. "Yeah, they're unusual." "Unusual," Johnny laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "That's one way to put it." He pushed food around his plate without eating, eyes constantly moving to scan the other diners. The cafeteria held maybe a dozen people, all park employees engaged in normal dinner conversations. But Johnny watched them like potential threats, his nervousness infectious. "Johnny," I kept my voice low, "what's the real story with those protocols?" His fork paused halfway to his mouth. For a moment, his expression shifted from nervous to something approaching fear. "The rules keep us safe. That's what they told me when I started." "Safe from what?" "That's..." Johnny set down his fork, hands shaking more noticeably now. "That's not the right question to ask. Questions lead to problems." The response felt rehearsed, like something he'd been told to say. But underneath the practiced words, I caught genuine fear. Johnny wasn't just nervous about the job. He was scared of something specific, something that made discussing the rules dangerous. "I've seen the bear," he whispered suddenly. "The one that walks backward. Same one, multiple times. Always in different locations, always watching." My appetite disappeared. Johnny's encounter matched mine exactly, down to the sense of being observed by the animal. But if we'd both seen the same bear exhibiting identical behavior in different areas of the park, the explanation couldn't be simple animal movement patterns. "How many times?" "Dozens, maybe more." Johnny's voice dropped even lower. "Started my second week. Every few days there it is, backing down some hillside right where I can see it. Never gets closer, never does anything threatening. Just watches." The pattern suggested surveillance rather than coincidence. A normal bear might cross a ranger's patrol route occasionally, but not with the frequency Johnny described. And the backward walking behavior was too distinctive to be natural, too specific to be accidental. "What about the other rules?" I pressed. Johnny glanced around the cafeteria again, then leaned even closer. All of them. The crying child, the 3 howls, the visitors with questions. 8 months of following protocols that don't make sense, watching things that shouldn't exist. "But you keep following them." "Because questioning them leads to problems." Johnny's repetition of the phrase carried weight, as if he'd learned the lesson through bitter experience. Rangers who ask too many questions get transferred, reassigned to different parks, different districts, or they just leave. The word "leave" hung in the air between us, loaded with implications Johnny didn't seem willing to elaborate. But his fear was genuine, suggesting that whatever happened to questioning rangers was worse than simple job transfers. Johnny pushed back from the table, dinner barely touched. "Bruce, listen to me. Tomorrow is going to be different." "Different how?" "Something not covered by the rules. Something new." Johnny's hands shook as he gathered his silverware. "When it happens, remember what I told you about questions." He stood up abruptly, leaving his tray on the table and walking toward the exit with quick, nervous steps. I watched him go, noting how he checked over his shoulder before disappearing through the doorway. Whatever had Johnny scared, it was specific and immediate. I finished my dinner alone, turning over his warnings. 8 months of following bizarre protocols, multiple encounters with impossible wildlife behavior, and now a prediction that tomorrow would bring something new. Johnny's fear suggested the rules were just the beginning of whatever I'd gotten myself into. Outside the cafeteria windows, darkness was settling over the mountains. Somewhere in that wilderness, a little girl in a light blue jacket had been missing for 3 days. A child who matched exactly the figure I'd seen running at impossible speed behind my patrol vehicle. The 3 people by the lake had watched my departure with synchronized precision, their mechanical movements suggesting careful coordination rather than coincidence. And tomorrow, according to Johnny's warning, something would happen that the rules didn't cover. I cleared my tray and headed back to my quarters, mind racing with questions I was apparently not supposed to ask. Whatever was happening at Yellowstone, it involved more than unusual wildlife behavior and strange patrol protocols. The fear in Johnny's voice had been real, immediate, personal. In my small apartment, I pulled out Summer's list of rules and read them again. 6 numbered items that had seemed bizarre during orientation now felt like warnings about specific threats. Rules designed not to test my compliance, but to protect me from encounters that other rangers had already experienced. But protect me from what, and why was tomorrow going to be different? I set my alarm for 6:30 and tried to push the questions aside. Johnny's warning about problems suggested that curiosity was dangerous here, that rangers who asked too many questions faced consequences worse than simple job loss. Tomorrow would bring answers, whether I was ready for them or not. I woke before my alarm, Johnny's warning about today being different echoing in my mind. The employee quarters felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing close as I replayed our conversation from dinner. Questions lead to problems. Rangers who ask too many questions get transferred, reassigned, or just leave. The radio crackled to life at exactly 7 a.m., Summer's voice cutting through the morning static with my assignment details. But something was off in her tone, a tightness I hadn't noticed before, like someone reading from a script while under pressure. Unit 12, you're assigned to Hayden Valley Patrol today. Southern Loop, standard checkpoints. Radio contact every 2 hours. Copy that. I kept my response neutral, but her delivery felt rehearsed in a way that made my skin crawl. Any specific concerns for the area? A pause longer than necessary. Negative. Routine patrol. Maintain standard protocols. The emphasis on standard protocols carried weight, as if she was reminding me about the rules rather than simply confirming routine procedures. I signed off and gathered my gear, Johnny's words playing on repeat. Something not covered by the rules. Something new. Hayden Valley spread across the Yellowstone River drainage like a massive meadow carved between forested ridges. During peak season, the area drew crowds for wildlife viewing. Bison herds, elk, the occasional wolf pack moving through the grassland. But this early in the morning, the landscape held an empty quality that should have been peaceful and instead felt watched. 20 minutes into my patrol, I spotted them. 3 people sat on a fallen log beside the road, positioned maybe 40 yards from the asphalt. 2 adults and what looked like a teenager, all facing away from the road toward the river. Their posture was identical to the group I'd seen yesterday at Yellowstone Lake. Too still, too precisely arranged, like mannequins positioned for a store display. As my vehicle approached, the teenager turned to look directly at me. The same mechanical movement, the same unsettling smile, the same feeling of being observed rather than simply noticed. But this couldn't be the same group. Hayden Valley was 30 miles from where I'd encountered them yesterday. I maintained speed, following Rule 6 by not stopping or engaging. In my rearview mirror, I watched all 3 figures turn in unison to track my departure, their synchronized movement too coordinated to be natural family behavior. 15 minutes later, I found another group. These 3 sat on a bench near an interpretive sign about thermal features. Different people, I was certain of that, but arranged in the same configuration. 2 adults, 1 younger person, all facing away from the road until my patrol vehicle came into view. Then, the mechanical turn, the practiced smile, the synchronized tracking of my progress. By noon, I'd counted 5 separate groups of 3, always positioned where I couldn't miss them, always responding with identical behavior. Different faces, different ages, but the same unsettling choreography repeated throughout my patrol route. The pattern was too obvious to be coincidence, too coordinated to be natural tourist behavior. Someone was staging these encounters, positioning people along my patrol route, teaching them specific responses to my presence. But why? And how did they know exactly where I'd be driving? The answer that kept surfacing made my stomach clench. My radio communications were being monitored. My routes were being tracked. Every aspect of my patrol schedule was being shared with whoever was orchestrating these encounters. Canyon Village Ranger Station sat at the junction of several major park roads, a hub for tourist services and administrative operations. I pulled into the parking lot for my scheduled midday break, noting 2 unfamiliar vehicles beside the building. A black SUV with government plates and a white sedan that looked more suited to city driving than park terrain. Inside the station, a woman in civilian clothes stood examining wall displays about park geology. She looked up as I entered, offering a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Mid-40s, blonde hair cut in a severe bob, wearing a blazer that seemed impractical for park environments. "You must be Ranger Rue." She extended her hand. "Dr. Juliet Thompson. I'm a researcher studying wildlife behavior patterns in the park." Her handshake was firm, clinical, like a doctor greeting a patient. But something about her introduction felt off. Researchers typically worked through proper channels, coordinated with park administration, operated with official clearance rather than appearing unannounced at ranger stations. Wildlife behavior? I kept my tone neutral. Specifically, how environmental stressors affect animal adaptation. Dr. Thompson studied my face with the intensity of someone conducting a psychological evaluation. "I understand you've had some interesting encounters during your first week." The comment hit like ice water. I hadn't discussed my encounters with anyone except Johnny, and those conversations had been private. How did a wildlife researcher know about the backward walking bear, the crying child, the 3 howls at Tower Fall? "Standard wildlife observations," I said carefully. "Of course." Her smile widened, but the expression felt practiced rather than genuine. "I'm particularly interested in your emotional responses to unusual situations, how you've been adapting to the protocols Summer provided." She knew about the rules, not just their existence, but their specific content and my compliance with them. The only way a civilian researcher could have that information was through access to confidential Park Service communications or direct briefings from my supervisors. "I follow all assigned protocols." "Excellent. Your military background suggests strong discipline and stress tolerance." Dr. Thompson consulted a small notebook. 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic, treated both military personnel and civilian casualties. Discharged with psychological evaluations noting hypervigilance and anxiety responses. My blood ran cold. Military service records were protected information, not accessible to park researchers conducting wildlife studies. The fact that she had specific details about my deployments and psychological evaluations meant she'd been granted security clearance far beyond what any legitimate scientist would need. "Those records are confidential. Your adaptation period is proceeding normally," she continued, ignoring my concern. "Compliance with unusual directives, appropriate stress responses, decision-making under pressure, all within expected parameters. Adaptation period." The phrase carried clinical weight, suggesting I was being evaluated rather than simply employed. But adaptation to what? And what were the expected parameters she was measuring? "What exactly are you studying, Dr. Thompson?" Her expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "Behavioral adaptation patterns. How individuals with specific psychological profiles respond to controlled environmental stressors." The words hit me like a physical blow. Controlled environmental stressors. The backward walking bear, the crying child, the three people sitting in perfect formation, all of it carefully orchestrated to produce specific stress responses. I wasn't being tested on park procedures. I was being used as a test subject. "I need to complete my patrol," I said, moving toward the door. "Of course. But Ranger Rue..." Dr. Thompson's voice stopped me at the threshold. "Remember that questioning the parameters can interfere with the adaptation process. Cooperation ensures the best possible outcome." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Follow the protocols, accept the encounters, don't ask questions about what was happening to me. The alternative was apparently the same fate that had befallen rangers who asked too many questions. I left the station without responding, my hands shaking as I unlocked my patrol vehicle. Dr. Thompson's clinical approach to my adaptation confirmed what Johnny's fear had suggested. We weren't rangers learning unusual local procedures. We were test subjects in some kind of psychological experiment, monitored and evaluated by researchers who had access to our most private medical information. The afternoon patrol passed in a haze of hypervigilance and growing paranoia. Every radio check with dispatch felt like surveillance. Every tourist I encountered could be another planted actor following a script. The landscape that had initially attracted me to this job now felt like a massive laboratory, with me as the primary specimen under observation. Evening brought assignment to the Old Faithful area, where thermal features created an otherworldly landscape of geysers, hot springs, and steaming pools. Tourist crowds thinned after sunset, leaving the boardwalks and viewing areas largely empty except for the occasional night photographer or late-arriving visitor. I was completing documentation at the visitor center when my radio crackled with an incoming transmission. "Base, this is Unit 14. I need immediate backup." Johnny's voice cut through the static, higher pitched than normal, edged with panic I'd never heard from him before. I grabbed the radio. "Unit 14, this is Unit 12. What's your location?" "Bruce?" Johnny's relief was audible. "Thank God, I'm being followed. The crying child, she's been tracking me for hours. Every time I try to leave my patrol route, she appears ahead of my vehicle." The transmission quality was poor, filled with interference that made his words hard to distinguish, but the fear in his voice was unmistakable, genuine terror that made my chest tighten with recognition. "Where are you now, Johnny?" "South of... Christ, she's running beside my truck again." "How is she keeping pace?" "I'm doing 40 miles per hour and she's just running alongside like it's nothing." His description matched my own encounter exactly. The impossible speed, the effortless stride, the feeling of being hunted rather than simply encountered. But if Johnny was experiencing the same thing, it confirmed that these weren't random events. Someone was orchestrating identical encounters for multiple rangers. "Johnny, follow Protocol 6. Drive away immediately." "I've been trying. Every time I change direction, she's already there waiting, like she knows where I'm going before I do." The transmission dissolved into static for several seconds, then cleared briefly. "Bruce, listen to me. The rules aren't protection. They're part of whatever this is. Don't trust..." The radio went dead. I tried raising him immediately. "Unit 14, respond. Johnny, do you copy?" Nothing but static. I contacted dispatch, reporting the lost communication and requesting Johnny's last known location. Summer's response came back within minutes, providing coordinates that placed him near the Grand Prismatic Thermal area, roughly 15 minutes from my position. I drove toward the location faster than park regulations allowed. Emergency lights activated, but no siren to avoid alarming tourists. Johnny's final words echoed in my mind. The rules aren't protection. They're part of whatever this is. His warning had been cut short, but the implication was clear. The protocols weren't designed to keep us safe from threats. They were designed to make us compliant with whatever was being done to us. I found Johnny's patrol vehicle 40 minutes later, parked beside a thermal pool near the Grand Prismatic viewing area. Unit 14 sat empty with the driver's door hanging open, engine still running, headlights illuminating wisps of steam rising from superheated water. Johnny was nowhere to be seen. I approached the vehicle carefully, hand instinctively moving toward my radio. Johnny's equipment was still inside. Clipboard, water bottle, the duty belt he never removed during patrol. His radio sat in the center console, power light glowing green, but when I tried to raise him, the speaker only emitted static. The thermal pool beside his vehicle was roughly circular, maybe 20 feet across, with water that bubbled and steamed at temperatures hot enough to kill. Warning signs posted around the area emphasized the danger of thermal features, the fatal consequences of contact with the superheated water. I searched the immediate area, calling Johnny's name and checking behind trees and rock formations where he might have taken shelter. No response, no sign of struggle, no indication of where he'd gone or why he'd abandoned his vehicle. When I radioed the incident to dispatch, Summer's response felt wrong from the first word. Copy, Unit 12. Will initiate standard missing person procedures. Return to base immediately for debriefing. No questions about Johnny's last known activities. No urgency about a missing ranger in a dangerous area. No coordination with search and rescue teams or requests for additional units to assist with the search. Just clinical acknowledgement and instructions for me to leave the scene. Shouldn't we establish a perimeter? Coordinate search teams? Negative. Return to base immediately. Ranger Scott's situation will be handled through appropriate channels. Ranger Scott's situation, not missing person emergency or potential medical incident, but a bureaucratic phrase that made Johnny sound like a paperwork problem rather than a human being in danger. I drove back toward Mammoth Hot Springs with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. Johnny's warning played on repeat. The rules aren't protection, they're part of whatever this is. Dr. Thompson's clinical questions about my adaptation period. Summer's scripted responses that lacked genuine concern for a missing colleague. Whatever was happening at Yellowstone, it involved more than psychological testing or wildlife research. Rangers who asked too many questions didn't just get transferred, they disappeared. And now Johnny was gone, vanishing without explanation while following the same protocols that were supposed to keep us safe. In my rearview mirror, steam continued rising from the thermal pool where I'd found Johnny's abandoned vehicle. The sight filled me with a dread I couldn't articulate, a certainty that whatever had happened to him was connected to the staged encounters, the clinical evaluations, and the growing sense that nothing about my employment was what it seemed. Tomorrow would indeed be different, just as Johnny had warned, because now I knew that questioning the rules might be the only way to survive them. I walked into the Mammoth Hot Springs administrative building at 8:15 the next morning, my patience finally exhausted. Johnny's abandoned patrol vehicle had haunted my sleep, along with his final radio transmission. The rules aren't protection, they're part of whatever this is. Dr. Thompson's clinical questions about my adaptation period had confirmed what I'd been trying to ignore. Something was fundamentally wrong with this place, and I needed answers. Summer looked up from her desk as I entered, coffee mug halfway to her lips. Her expression shifted from routine morning pleasantries to something more guarded when she saw my face. I'd spent the night rehearsing this conversation, preparing for evasion and bureaucratic deflection, but I wasn't leaving without the truth. Bruce, you're early for your shift. Where's Johnny Scott? The directness of the question caught her off guard. Summer set down her coffee with careful precision, buying time while she formulated a response. Ranger Scott has been reassigned. Personnel matters are confidential. His patrol vehicle was abandoned next to a thermal pool. Engine running, door open, no sign of him anywhere. I remained standing, using my height advantage to project authority. That's not reassignment. That's a missing person emergency. The situation has been handled through appropriate channels. The same clinical phrase she'd used over the radio. But now I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she arranged papers on her desk. Summer was nervous, which meant she knew exactly what had happened to Johnny. What appropriate channels? Search and rescue? Local law enforcement? I leaned forward, placing my palms flat on her desk, or the same channels that brought Dr. Thompson to evaluate my stress responses. Summer's face went pale. The mention of Dr. Thompson had hit home, confirming that the wildlife researcher's appearance wasn't coincidental. Summer knew about the psychological evaluations, the clinical interest in my adaptation period, the fact that someone was studying my responses to the bizarre encounters. I don't know what you're talking about. Bullshit. Military authority crept into my voice, the tone I'd used to command medics under fire. A researcher with access to my confidential military records shows up asking about my emotional responses to unusual situations. She knows about the rules you gave me, knows about my compliance with protocols that make no sense. How does a wildlife biologist get that information? Summer's composure finally cracked. She pushed back from her desk, standing up with movements that were too quick, too defensive. Bruce, you need to calm down. Johnny tried to warn me before he disappeared, said the rules weren't protection, they were part of whatever this is. I gestured around the office, encompassing the building, the park, the entire situation. Part of what, Summer? What exactly have you gotten me involved in? She walked to the office door and turned the lock, sealing us in privacy. When she faced me again, her professional mask had slipped completely, revealing genuine fear underneath. You weren't supposed to figure it out this quickly. The admission hit like a physical blow. Summer's words confirmed that there was something to figure out, something deliberate and planned about my experiences. The backward walking bear, the crying child, the 3 people sitting in perfect formation, all of it orchestrated for my benefit. Figure what out? Summer moved to the window, staring out at the parking lot as if checking for surveillance. You were specifically recruited, Bruce. Your military background, your PTSD diagnosis, your psychological profile, everything made you an ideal candidate. Candidate for what? An experimental program. Research into how trauma survivors respond to perceived paranormal threats. Summer's voice was barely above a whisper. Dr. Thompson heads a team studying psychological resilience under controlled stress conditions. The room seemed to tilt around me. Controlled stress conditions. The bizarre encounters hadn't been random park phenomena or supernatural events. They'd been psychological experiments designed to trigger specific responses in test subjects with PTSD. The bear, the crying child, all of it was fake. Staged using actors, technology, and psychological manipulation techniques. Summer turned from the window, her expression heavy with guilt. The rules were designed to gauge compliance and fear responses. The encounters measured stress adaptation and decision-making under pressure. My hands clenched into fists as the full scope of the deception became clear. Every night, I'd lain awake wondering about impossible wildlife behavior and strange coincidences. My military training had been screaming that something was wrong, but I'd forced myself to follow orders like a good soldier. They'd weaponized my conditioning against me. How long? The program's been running for 2 years. You're the 7th test subject we've processed. 7th. That meant 6 other rangers had gone through the same psychological torture, been manipulated and studied like laboratory rats. What happened to the others? Most completed the evaluation period successfully. They were transferred to other positions with excellent recommendations and compensation packages for their participation. Most? Summer's hesitation told me everything. A few subjects proved unsuitable. They questioned the scenarios too aggressively, threatened to expose the research. Johnny's face flashed in my mind, his nervous energy, his fear of asking questions, his warning about problems for rangers who were too curious. Johnny was unsuitable. Ranger Scott couldn't accept the parameters. He kept investigating, documenting inconsistencies, trying to contact outside authorities. Summer's voice carried genuine regret. He was transferred to another facility for extended evaluation. Another facility. Not reassignment or job transfer, but something that sounded disturbingly like indefinite detention. Johnny hadn't disappeared. He'd been removed for failing to comply with psychological manipulation. The missing child story was fabricated. There never was a missing child. The crying girl is an actress named Emily. She's part of Dr. Thompson's team. The revelation made my stomach clench. I'd driven away from what I believed was a terrified 8-year-old because the rules had forbidden investigation. My military training to protect civilians had warred with my need to follow orders, creating exactly the kind of psychological conflict the researchers wanted to study. The 3 people sitting together, researchers monitoring your reactions. They rotate through different locations along your patrol routes, measuring stress responses and compliance levels. Every patrol had been a laboratory session, with observers positioned to record my behavior and evaluate my psychological state. The synchronized movements, the mechanical turning to watch my vehicle, they'd been clinical rather than supernatural, conducted by scientists rather than mysterious figures. You've been monitoring my radio communications. Every transmission is recorded. Your quarters are under video surveillance. Sleep patterns, eating habits, social interactions, all documented for analysis. Summer met my eyes directly. Every aspect of your experience has been controlled and measured. The violation was complete and systematic. They'd stripped away my privacy, my autonomy, my basic human dignity in service of research I'd never consented to participate in. My apartment wasn't home. It was an observation chamber where my most private moments were recorded for scientific evaluation. I want out, immediately. Summer's expression grew pained. That's not possible. What do you mean, not possible? Your employment contract includes a psychological evaluation period that legally prevents your departure for 6 months. Breaking the agreement would result in financial penalties and potential legal action. I stared at her, understanding flooding through me like ice water. The employment paperwork I'd signed in my desperation for work and isolation had trapped me in a psychological experiment. They'd used my PTSD, my need for structure and authority, to make me complicit in my own manipulation. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the office. Summer glanced at the door, then back at me with an expression that mixed apology and fear. "They're coming!" The door handle rattled, followed by a knock. Dr. Thompson's voice carried through the wood with clinical authority. "Summer, we need to discuss Ranger Rue's progress evaluation." Stephen's voice joined hers. "Bruce, you in there? Need to talk through some things." They'd been monitoring this conversation, watching through whatever surveillance equipment they'd installed in the administrative building. My confrontation with Summer hadn't been a private demand for truth. It had been another test scenario designed to measure my responses when the deception was revealed. Summer moved toward the door, her hand hovering over the lock. "Bruce, please understand. Your compliance has been exceptional. Dr. Thompson wants to extend the program, offer you additional compensation for continued participation." I refuse. That's not really an option. The knocking grew more insistent. Dr. Thompson's voice carried a sharper edge. "Summer, open the door." I looked around the office, noting the single window that faced the parking lot and the back door that led to a supply corridor. My military training kicked in automatically, evaluating escape routes and tactical options. They'd underestimated how quickly I could shift from compliant test subject to someone fighting for survival. "Bruce," Stephen's voice carried false concern. "We just want to talk. Work out the details of your continued assignment." Continued assignment. Not employment or career opportunity, but assignment. Like a prisoner being transferred between facilities. Johnny's fate was becoming clearer. Extended evaluation at another facility probably meant indefinite psychological experimentation until subjects either broke completely or proved useful enough to release. Summer reached for the door lock, her movement reluctant, but inevitable. Whatever authority I'd thought she possessed was illusory. She was as much a tool of the research program as the actors and staged encounters. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The lock clicked open. Dr. Thompson entered first, clipboard in hand, followed by Stephen, whose relaxed demeanor had shifted to something more predatory. Behind them, two men in Park Service uniforms blocked the doorway, security personnel whose presence confirmed that this wasn't a friendly discussion about employment terms. "Ranger Rue." Dr. Thompson's smile was professional and completely empty. "I understand you have concerns about the program structure." "I have concerns about being used as a test subject without informed consent. Your employment contract clearly outlined the evaluation period and research components. Legal review confirmed full compliance with federal guidelines for psychological research. The clinical language was designed to make my objections sound irrational, my anger inappropriate. But the two security guards flanking the door suggested that legal compliance wasn't their primary concern." Stephen stepped forward, hands raised in a gesture of false reassurance. "Bruce, nobody wants this to get complicated. The program offers excellent compensation for a few more months of participation. Think about your future career prospects." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Cooperation meant financial rewards and positive recommendations. Resistance meant whatever had happened to Johnny and the other unsuitable subjects who'd questioned the research too aggressively. "What happened to the Rangers who refused to continue?" Dr. Thompson consulted her clipboard. "Extended evaluation at specialized facilities designed to address their specific psychological needs. Very comprehensive care. Specialized facilities. Extended evaluation. Comprehensive care." The euphemisms couldn't disguise what she was describing: indefinite detention for people who discovered they were being used as experimental subjects. I looked at Summer, searching for any sign of the person who'd shown genuine regret moments earlier, but her expression had shifted back to professional neutrality, the brief crack in her facade sealed by the presence of her supervisors. Through the office window, I could see more Park Service vehicles pulling into the parking lot. Whatever happened next, they'd prepared for multiple contingencies. My compliance was preferred, but they were ready to handle resistance with more direct methods. Dr. Thompson stepped closer, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining simple concepts to a confused patient. "Bruce, your stress responses have provided valuable data about trauma survivor adaptation. With a few months of additional testing, we can develop treatment protocols that will help thousands of veterans with similar conditions." The appeal to my desire to help other veterans was perfectly calculated, designed to exploit my guilt about civilian casualties and my need for redemption through service. But Johnny's warning echoed in my mind. The rules aren't protection, they're part of whatever this is. "I won't continue." The security guards shifted position, hands moving toward equipment belts that carried more than standard park ranger gear. Dr. Thompson's professional smile faded slightly, revealing the calculating researcher underneath. "That's unfortunate, but we're prepared for various responses to program disclosure." Stephen moved to block my path to the window while the security personnel closed the door behind them, sealing the office. The casual meeting about continued assignment had transformed into something resembling an arrest, though no charges had been mentioned and no rights had been read. Summer stood beside her desk, hands clasped in front of her like someone attending a funeral. The woman who'd shown me compassion and regret had disappeared, replaced by a compliant administrator following research protocols that prioritized data collection over human dignity. My military training screamed warnings about tactical disadvantage and limited escape routes. 4 people between me and the main exit, windows that faced an occupied parking lot, and backup personnel positioned outside the building. They'd planned for this contingency, prepared for the moment when a test subject learned the truth and refused to continue participating. Dr. Thompson opened her clipboard, consulting notes that probably contained detailed psychological profiles and response predictions. "Ranger Rue, The next phase of the program involves more intensive evaluation scenarios. Your cooperation will ensure the process remains comfortable for everyone involved. The clinical language couldn't disguise the threat. Cooperation meant continued psychological manipulation under laboratory conditions. Resistance meant forced participation through whatever methods they'd used on Johnny and the other unsuitable subjects. I looked around the room one final time, memorizing positions and calculating angles. They'd made a critical error in assuming that revealing the truth would make me more compliant rather than more dangerous. My PTSD hadn't just created psychological vulnerabilities, it had also honed survival instincts they apparently hadn't factored into their research design. The standoff stretched between us, tension building as each side evaluated options and calculated next moves. Outside the window, more vehicles continued arriving, their occupants taking positions around the administrative building. Whatever happened next, my days as a compliant test subject were over. The silence stretched between us for 3 more seconds before I made my move. My chair scraped against the floor as I stood abruptly, the sudden motion drawing everyone's attention upward. In that split second of distraction, I grabbed Summer's heavy ceramic coffee mug from her desk and hurled it at the nearest security guard's face. The impact sent him stumbling backward into his partner, creating the opening I needed. I lunged toward the back door that led to the supply corridor, muscle memory from Afghanistan taking over as my training kicked in. Stephen reached for me, but I drove my elbow into his solar plexus, doubling him over with a grunt of pain. Dr. Thompson shouted something about securing the perimeter, but I was already through the door and into the narrow hallway beyond. The supply corridor connected to the building's rear exit, a route I'd memorized during my first day orientation without realizing I'd ever need it for escape. Behind me, boots pounded against linoleum as the security team regrouped and gave chase. I could hear Dr. Thompson's voice coordinating over radio, her clinical tone replaced by sharp command authority. The rear exit opened onto a loading dock behind the administrative building. I dropped from the concrete platform to ground level, scanning for cover and escape routes. 30 yards ahead, a maintenance shed offered concealment, but beyond that lay open parking areas where they could easily spot me. I needed to reach the trees. Footsteps echoed from inside the building, getting closer. I sprinted across the open ground toward a stand of lodgepole pines that marked the beginning of the wilderness area. My chest burned with exertion, but adrenaline pushed me forward as shouts erupted behind me. Subject heading northwest from the administrative building, someone reported over radio. All units converge on Grid 7. Subject. Not employee, not person, but subject, confirming that they'd never seen me as anything more than laboratory equipment that had malfunctioned. I reached the tree line and kept running, using the forest canopy to break line of sight with my pursuers. My patrol routes had given me detailed knowledge of the terrain around Mammoth Hot Springs, including game trails and service roads that didn't appear on tourist maps. 20 minutes of hard running brought me to where I'd parked Unit 12 that morning, the white Ford Explorer sitting alone in the visitor parking area. The vehicle started immediately, and I pulled out of the lot with deliberate calm, fighting every instinct to floor the accelerator. Panic would draw attention. Normal driving patterns would buy me time to reach the park's north entrance before they could coordinate a full response. The highway toward the Roosevelt Arch stretched ahead, 2 lanes of asphalt that represented freedom from the psychological prison I'd been trapped in. I maintained the speed limit, checking my mirrors constantly for pursuing vehicles. 5 miles from the entrance, I began to believe I might actually escape. Then I saw the roadblock. 3 Park Service vehicles had been positioned across both lanes just before the entrance station, creating an impassable barrier. Summer stood beside the lead vehicle, radio in hand, while Stephen leaned against another truck with his arms crossed. They'd anticipated my route and moved to intercept. I pulled to the shoulder 200 yards from the checkpoint, hands gripping the steering wheel as I evaluated options. Driving through the roadblock would require ramming park service vehicles, potentially injuring people who were following orders rather than making free choices. My military training included rules of engagement that prohibited unnecessary violence against non-combatants. But staying meant returning to Dr. Thompson's extended evaluation program, whatever that actually entailed. I turned off the engine and grabbed my day pack from the passenger seat, leaving Unit 12 unlocked with the keys in the ignition. If they wanted the vehicle back, they could collect it themselves. My escape would continue on foot through terrain they couldn't follow with cars. The forest on the park's northern edge was dense enough to provide cover, but open enough for fast movement. I struck out across country, using compass bearings to maintain direction toward the boundary while staying well clear of established trails where they might set up ambush points. 15 minutes into my cross-country trek, I heard my name being called from somewhere ahead. Not the harsh authority of security personnel, but a young woman's voice carrying genuine urgency. "Bruce, please, I need to talk to you." I stopped behind a large boulder, scanning the trees for the source of the voice. Movement caught my eye. A small figure in hiking clothes emerging from behind a cluster of aspens maybe 40 yards ahead. Even at distance, I recognized her immediately. The crying child. Emily, according to Summer's revelation. The actress who'd run behind my patrol vehicle at impossible speeds. The centerpiece of the psychological manipulation designed to exploit my protective instincts toward children. But something was different about her posture and movement. The mechanical quality was gone, replaced by natural human urgency. She approached my position with her hands visible, making no attempt at stealth or concealment. "I know you don't trust me," she called out, "but I can help you get out of here." I remained behind the boulder, evaluating whether this was another test scenario designed to measure my responses under stress. "You're part of the program." I was. Emily stopped 20 feet away. Close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid triggering my defensive reflexes. But what they're doing isn't what I signed up for. She looked younger than I'd realized during our previous encounter, maybe early 20s, with intelligent eyes that held none of the vacant quality I'd seen during her performance as the lost child. Her hiking clothes were practical rather than costume-like, suggesting she'd been moving through the wilderness for some time. "You've been manipulating me for weeks. I've been following a script they gave me, playing a role to trigger specific psychological responses." Emily's voice carried genuine regret. "But the program isn't just research, Bruce. It's developing techniques for military psychological operations." The confirmation hit like ice water. Dr. Thompson's clinical questions about stress adaptation, her interest in trauma survivors, the systematic approach to psychological manipulation. It all made sense if the research was designed to develop interrogation and psychological warfare techniques rather than legitimate medical treatment. What military applications? Breaking enemy combatants without physical torture, inducing psychological compliance through controlled paranormal experiences. Emily glanced over her shoulder, checking for pursuit. The backward-walking bear, the staged encounters, the impossible scenarios. They're testing how to make people question their own sanity while maintaining obedience to authority. My stomach clenched as the full scope of the deception became clear. They hadn't just been studying my stress responses. They'd been refining psychological torture techniques using my PTSD as a testing ground. The protocols hadn't been protection or hazing, but components in a systematic method for destroying people's grip on reality. The other test subjects? Some completed the program and were released with payoffs to stay quiet. Others who refused to continue. Emily's expression darkened. They don't get transferred to other facilities. They disappear permanently. Johnny's face flashed in my mind. His nervous energy, his fear of asking questions, his final radio transmission cut short. They hadn't transferred him for extended evaluation. They'd eliminated him because he'd figured out the truth and refused to continue participating. "Why are you helping me?" Because I've been watching what this does to people for 6 months. You're not the first veteran they've used, and you won't be the last unless someone exposes what's happening here. Emily reached into her jacket pocket, producing a hand-drawn map. There's a game trail that leads to the park boundary about 2 miles northeast of here. It doesn't show up on official maps because it follows an old mining access route. She handed me the map, her fingers trembling slightly. The boundary fence has weak spots where you can cut through. Once you're on private land, they can't pursue without legal authorization they won't want to request. I studied the map, noting landmarks and compass bearings that would guide me to the hidden trail. Emily had marked potential hazards, stream crossings, and the approximate location of boundary weak points with the detail of someone who'd scouted the route carefully. How do I know this isn't another test? You don't. Emily met my eyes directly, but the alternative is going back to Summer and Dr. Thompson for extended evaluation. How many more months of psychological torture are you willing to endure while they perfect their techniques? She was right. Whether this was genuine help or another manipulation, my only choice was to keep moving toward the boundary. Staying meant accepting whatever fate had befallen Johnny and the other unsuitable subjects. The program extends beyond Yellowstone? They're planning expansion to other national parks. Remote locations with vulnerable employees who need work badly enough to accept unusual conditions. Emily's voice carried urgency. Veterans with PTSD, people with financial problems, anyone desperate enough to sign contracts without reading the fine print carefully. The revelation made my chest tighten. Other parks meant other rangers being subjected to the same psychological manipulation, other people having their trauma weaponized against them for military research purposes. If I escaped but did nothing to expose the program, I'd be complicit in whatever happened to future victims. Go. Emily backed away, preparing to disappear into the forest. They'll realize I'm missing soon and send search teams. The trail starts at a lightning-struck pine with a double trunk about half a mile northeast of here. What happens to you? I'll tell them I got lost tracking you, that you disappeared into terrain I couldn't follow. Her smile was sad but determined. They need me for future scenarios, so they'll believe the story. Emily turned and jogged back toward the trees, her movement natural and unscripted. Within minutes, she'd vanished into the forest, leaving me alone with her map and the knowledge that even the people implementing the program had moral limits. I resumed my cross-country movement, following compass bearings toward the lightning-struck pine she'd described. The game trail proved to be exactly where her map indicated. A narrow path worn by decades of wildlife movement, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The route led through dense forest and across 2 stream beds, following contours that kept me below ridgelines where I'd be visible to aerial surveillance. Emily's scouting had been thorough, accounting for both natural hazards and tactical considerations that suggested military training or extensive outdoor experience. 2 hours of steady hiking brought me to the park boundary, marked by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire that stretched between metal posts driven deep into rocky soil. The barrier looked formidable, but Emily's map had marked a section where the fence crossed a seasonal creek bed, creating a depression where the bottom edge didn't quite meet the ground. I pulled wire cutters from my emergency kit, a tool I'd carried since my military service for situations exactly like this. The fence yielded to persistent cutting, creating an opening just large enough to crawl through onto private land beyond. The difference was immediate and profound. I was no longer a test subject in an experimental program, but a civilian on private property with constitutional rights they couldn't simply ignore. Whatever authority Dr. Thompson's research team possessed ended at the park boundary. 3 hours of hiking through ranch land brought me to a small town whose main street consisted of a gas station, diner, and general store clustered around a highway intersection. I used the payphone outside the gas station to make a call I'd been planning since my second day at Yellowstone. Dave, it's Bruce Rue. I need help. David Chen had been my squad leader in Afghanistan. a career soldier who'd understood the psychological costs of combat better than most officers. After discharge, he'd established a network of veterans who helped each other transition to civilian life without bureaucratic interference. "Jesus, Bruce, where are you calling from? Your number came up as some town in Montana." "Long story, but I need to disappear for a while. New identity, clean transportation. Somewhere the government can't track me down easily." Dave's pause carried the weight of someone who'd handled similar requests before. "How deep is the hole you're in?" "Deep enough that people are disappearing. Military psychological research that's crossed legal and ethical lines." "Copy that. There's a truck stop 40 miles south of your position, Blue Bear Travel Plaza. Go to Pump 7 and wait. Someone will find you within 2 hours." The connection ended without further explanation, but I trusted Dave's network more than any official channels. Veterans who'd been betrayed by bureaucrats and researchers understood the importance of mutual protection. The ride came exactly as promised. A long-haul trucker who asked no questions about my situation or destination. We drove through the night toward Colorado, where Dave's contacts had prepared documentation and resources for starting over. Months passed in a small cabin outside Denver, where I worked construction jobs and avoided any contact with government agencies. The false identity held up under casual scrutiny, but I knew it wouldn't survive serious investigation if they decided to hunt for me aggressively. Through encrypted communications with Dave's network, I learned that the Yellowstone program had indeed expanded. New rangers at Glacier National Park and Grand Teton were receiving identical protocol lists, experiencing the same impossible encounters designed to break down psychological resistance. The crying child actor had been deployed to multiple locations, along with other performers playing roles in the expanded psychological manipulation program. Dr. Thompson's research had evolved beyond testing techniques to active implementation. The military applications Emily had warned about were becoming operational, with veterans being recruited as both test subjects and unwitting trainers for psychological warfare specialists. I began documenting everything I remembered about my time in the program. The specific rules, the staged encounters, the clinical evaluations, and the systematic approach to exploiting PTSD symptoms. The information would form the foundation for exposing the operation, but I needed more than personal testimony to bring down a program with military backing. The encrypted messages from Dave's network provided updates on other escapees and current victims. Johnny's disappearance had been explained as a voluntary resignation due to family emergency, his personnel file sealed to prevent inquiries. 2 more rangers had vanished from the expanded programs, their fates officially listed as job transfers to undisclosed locations. Emily continued working for the program, but had become a valuable source of intelligence about new developments and victims. Her coded messages revealed that Dr. Thompson was planning a significant escalation, moving beyond national parks to recruit test subjects from VA hospitals and veteran job programs nationwide. The scope of the operation was growing beyond what individual action could address. But Dave's network included investigative journalists, civil rights attorneys, and retired military officers with congressional connections. The foundation for exposure was taking shape, built on testimonies from multiple escaped subjects and documented evidence of systematic psychological abuse. Sitting in my cabin as winter approached, I studied maps of national parks where the program was reportedly active. Each location represented dozens of potential victims being subjected to the same psychological torture I'd experienced, their trauma being weaponized for research they'd never consented to participate. The program had made one critical error in its design. By recruiting veterans with combat experience, they'd created adversaries who understood tactical thinking and possessed survival skills honed under extreme conditions. We weren't just test subjects. We were soldiers who'd learned to fight systems that tried to destroy us. The war for psychological freedom was just beginning, and I intended to win it.